All right, it's my enormous pleasure to have on Bad Faith Podcast for the first time Scott Ritter. He is a former Marine Corps intelligence officer and former UN Special Commission's weapons inspector. Welcome to Bad Faith.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Before we get started, I want to spend today sort of updating the audience on what's been going on in Ukraine, particularly since the Putin-Trump meeting about 2 weeks ago in Alaska. But for folks who aren't as familiar with their background, I wanted to just offer an opportunity for you to give a sort of a gloss as to why you have particular expertise in Russia and the mindset of the Russian people and Russian politics, and why it's so important, you think, for your perspective to be heard in contrast to what we typically get in the mainstream.
Sure. I'm of a certain age, a boomer. I was raised during the Cold War. My father was a career Air Force officer, and therefore my childhood was heavily influenced by the Cold War. He was a Vietnam veteran. He was, deployed to Vietnam several times. But I went to high school in three different places. One was in Hawaii. We were there when the Vietnam War ended, when South Vietnam fell. We took in Vietnamese refugees into our home, boat people. That deeply impacted us. We then moved to Turkey, and I went to high school in Turkey, George C. Marshall High School in Ankara. Turkey's on the front line of the Cold War, neighboring the Soviet Union. It was a world of spy versus spy. A whole bunch of Cold War realities became clear, who the enemy was, at least who we were trained to believe the enemy was. And then from Turkey, I ended up going to Germany, West Germany. I graduated high school at Kaiserslautern American High School. West Germany is the front line during the Cold War. I mean, you might as well have been at war because it was a constant war footing. Again, aircraft flying over all the time, tanks, exercises in your backyard. And I grew up aware of the fact that if the balloon went up, the Soviet 20th Guards Army was about 12 hours away from my home, that my home was on their line of advance. So we also lived next door to a nuclear weapons storage facility that would have been hit by Soviet nuclear weapons early on in a conflict. So if the balloon went up, we'd be dead. My father, on occasion, would disappear down into a bunker because things got hot. And during that time, there could have been a war at any time. So when you drove to school in the morning, there was a flash, let's say on the highway, the sun hit the rearview mirror of a truck. First thing that went through your mind is that the nuke? That's how I grew up. When I graduated, I said, I need to defend my country against this Soviet threat. And so I joined the military. I went on to college and went into the Marine Corps. I studied Russian history, Russian area studies in college. It took 2 years of the Russian language. Why? Because you have to know your enemy if you're going to defeat your enemy. And I viewed the Russians as my enemy. This was in my blood. I mean, people may laugh about it today, but when we talked about better red than dead, we meant it. Kill a commie for mommy wasn't just a saying. It was the reality. I was joining the military to kill Russians, to be there on the front line when they came across the border. And for 2.5 years in the Marine Corps, I did just that. I specialized in training to kill Russians. But in 1987, as history is wont to do, they throw a curveball at you. And Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan sat down and signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty to get rid of an entire class of missiles that were destabilizing Europe and bringing the United States and the Soviet Union dangerously close to nuclear war.
We proposed the most sweeping and generous arms control proposal in history. We offered the complete elimination of all ballistic missiles, Soviet and American, from the face of the earth by 1996. While we parted company with this American offer still on the table, we're closer than ever before to agreements that could lead to a safer world without nuclear weapons. So my fellow Americans, I cannot promise, nor can any president promise, that the talks in Iceland or any future discussions with Mr. Gorbachev will lead inevitably to great breakthroughs or momentous treaty signings. We will not abandon the guiding principle we took to Reykjavik. We prefer no agreement than to bring home a bad agreement to the United States. And on this point, I know you're also interested in the question of whether there will be another summit. There was no indication by Mr. Gorbachev as to when or whether he plans to travel to the United States, as we agreed he would last year in Geneva. I repeat tonight that our invitation stands and that we continue to believe additional meetings would be useful. But that's a decision the Soviets must make.
The Marine Corps was tasked with providing a certain number of Russian language speakers to a new organization called the On-Site Inspection Agency to implement this treaty, to go to the Soviet Union and carry this out. And I happened to be one of the people that they brought in to do this. Long story short, I was the first inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union when that treaty went into force on July 1st, 1988. I take pride in that. Not because I was better than anybody else, it's just I got lucky, but better lucky than not. For 2.5 years, I did this job. And I will tell you this, a breakthrough moment came on New Year's Eve of 1988-89, crossing over. Up until then, I still viewed the Soviets as my enemy, as a hostile force, even though we worked with them closely on a daily basis to implement this treaty. But on that night, we received invitations to go into the homes of our Soviet colleagues. And I sat down with a Soviet family, with a man who produced missiles that were targeted at American cities. He was sitting down with a Marine who was trained to kill him, to view them as the enemy. And we had just a great evening. We talked. We told bad jokes, good jokes. We watched his president speak, my president speak. He brought in the neighbors. We got to know them as human beings. I got to see that he had a wife. He had a daughter. He loved them very much. He wanted good things for them. And when the evening ended, we all left his home and gathered around the big New Year's tree that was on the city square, together with the rest of the civilians, the citizens of Votkins, this small little town. And we just greeted each other. And it was just one of these great moments where I sat there and I went, I don't want to kill these people anymore. I mean, we've got to do better than just training to kill one another. And since that time, I've been working towards promoting disarmament, promoting an end to nuclear, the potential of nuclear war. And it's an uphill struggle, though, because here in the United States, the American people continue to be infected by Russophobia that dates back to McCarthy era, where we're taught that the Russians are bad, that they're communists, that they're evil, they mean us harm. And so I've just dedicated myself to making the world a better place by promoting good relations between Russia and the United States, not because I'm a Kremlin puppet, but because I'm a loyal American citizen who believes that nuclear war isn't the answer. And the best way to avoid a nuclear war is to prevent a nuclear war. And the best way to do that is to have good relations with Russia. But I will say this, having traveled to Russia extensively and met with the Russian people, I'm not asking much here. They're not hard to like. They're good people. They have great culture, great history. They like Americans. They want to get to know Americans better. They don't pose a threat to us at all. So it's not like I have to reinvent history or do a lot of spinning here to sell something. Selling friendship with the Russian people is one of the easiest things in the world to do. If people will just have an open mind and forget what they've been taught and be open to considering new ideas, new realities. Russia today is a fantastic country populated by a fantastic people whom we should treat as our equals. We should treat with respect, just like we would demand that they treat us with respect.
Scott, it's really interesting to hear you sort of draw on your experience living abroad, growing up as what we called third culture kids. I say we because I was one as well. We moved to Saudi Arabia in 92 and then in Kenya in 95. As a part of what has motivated you to, I think what it sounded like to me you were saying is to take more seriously the threat of global conflict, the threat of nuclear war, because you were physically proximate to it. And it resonates with me. I've had similar sort of experiences where, my family moved to New York in 2001, 6 months before 9/11. And I remember experiencing a sort of gap between my experience of 9/11 as someone who was in Kenya when the embassy was bombed in 98, who had, lived places where bad things had happened and didn't have the expectation of kind of like a shield of safety that I think most Americans grow up, at least younger Americans grow up believing is in place. And so when you say to me, I've seen how close we've come, I've physically been close to potential danger at the height of kind of Cold War escalation, it makes a lot of sense why I hear you calling back to this refrain of the threat level that has emerged of late. So I've heard you cite specifically this idea that the CIA advised in November of last year that there was about a 50% chance of a nuclear conflict emerging. Can you speak to the gravity of that, what those statistics or what the likelihood is like today, and why that is the case?
Well, certainly. First of all, when I was a child a long time ago, um, you know, we actually, were trained to get under our desks. As I
Sure.
told you, the threat of nuclear war was so real that a flash in the mirror of a truck on the highway, the first thought is this it? Is this the nuclear bomb? My dad went into the bunker a couple times. My parents had a code word that they used. It was derived from a book and a movie popular at the time, Alas Babylon. And my dad, if he called my mom and said Alas Babylon, that meant that there was a very good chance there was going to be a war between NATO and the Soviet Union, and that meant nuclear weapons. And that was a signal for my mom to bring the children in, bring out the photo albums, and begin to reflect on what it meant to be a family, so that there would be love amongst us at the moment of our death. And this happened twice as a child. I remember this. This resonates with you. It's real. But somehow, after the success of the treaty that I played a role in, getting rid of these nuclear weapons and additional treaties to follow the Soviet Union, people forgot about the danger of nuclear weapons. It's almost as if Americans today live oblivious to the fact that we still have 1,550 strategic nuclear weapons targeted against Russia and China, and Russia has 1,550 strategic nuclear weapons targeted against us. One of these weapons going off kills an entire city. 1,550 of them going off kills the entire world. The world will not survive. There will be a nuclear winter, the radiation. You don't want to survive a nuclear war. And yet this is the reality that we live in. Now, we had reduced the threat threshold. We weren't viewing the Russians as an active enemy until recently, because of, the expansion of NATO, because of the military industrial complex needing an enemy to justify continuing to spend $1 trillion of taxpayer money building up a defense, for what? How do you justify that money unless there's a threat? So we create a threat. We call the Russians a threat. And then we engage in a proxy war in Ukraine that threatens the existential survival of Russia. So Russia begins to talk about, the necessity of having a nuclear deterrence against an American policy objective of the strategic defeat of Russia. That was articulated by the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, of Joe Biden back in 2022. The goal and objective of the United States and Ukraine is the strategic defeat of Russia. What does that mean? It means not only defeating them militarily on the battlefield, but starving them economically through sanctions that would bring about societal unrest and political collapse. We wanted to bring down the government of Vladimir Putin. Now imagine if a country was targeting the United States similarly. How would we feel about people saying our goal is to end the constitutional republic of the United States? We'd say, hell no. And we'd be willing to use whatever means necessary to prevent that. And that's what Russia has said, that they will use whatever means necessary to prevent, being strategically defeated. And this means nuclear weapons. So last fall, we had a situation where the Biden administration was talking with the British and the French about greenlighting Ukraine's use of long-range strike weapons, British Storm Shadow missiles, French Scout missiles, and American ATACMS missiles to strike targets in the strategic depth of Russia. And Russia basically let it be known that if this happens, Russia will not just limit the retaliation to Ukraine. On September 13th, I was supposed to go to the Russian embassy to attend a cultural event. And I remember Anatoly Antonov, he's the ambassador, and he had been talking to me about how do we defeat Russophobia for several years. And one of the ways was to bring the reality of Russian culture to the American people. So this was an event that he had planned for a long time, to bring a Russian pianist in to play, I forget what it is, Rachmaninoff or something, but, a big deal. He was pale-faced that night. He was very nervous. Why? I found out later, because he had to make a phone call on behalf of the Russian government to people in the United States government or affiliate, saying that if Biden signs off on this declaration authorizing the use, the Russian response will not just not be limited to Ukraine, but they will strike Washington, D.C. No ifs, ands, or buts. And Biden didn't sign it because what do? But later on in November, Biden had changed his mind. Pressure had been placed on him. He was now ready to authorize the use of the ATACMS missiles. We had the director of plans for the Strategic Command, the warfighting, nuclear warfighting, give a presentation in Washington, D.C. to a think tank where, when answering the question, he said, we are ready to have a nuclear exchange with Russia. We are ready to have a nuclear exchange with Russia, and we believe we will win. Now, this could just be rhetoric, but
But I'm
later
sorry,
on, I went on and
who was it that was
Rear
saying that
Admiral
we were
Thomas
ready?
Buchanan. He's the director of plans. He's the man who makes the war-fighting plans for the United States for nuclear war. And to CSIS in Washington, D.C. in November, he said, we are ready for a nuclear war with Russia, and we will win a nuclear war with Russia. He
What
also
does that
said
even
something interesting.
mean?
He said, maybe we need to be honest with the American people about what winning is, because even
Right.
though we theoretically win, a life in America will forever change. It won't be what you think it is, because there won't be running water, there won't be electricity, there won't be food supplies, there will be martial law. People will be dead. It won't, life will end. So you won't be an American anymore. But they were ready to do this. I started knocking on doors in Congress to get this policy changed. And I remember having a conversation with a very senior Democrat. And I said, I don't want you to give me classified information, because you can't. But the CIA, according to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, have thinks that the Russians are bluffing. Is your understanding that the CIA thinks they're bluffing? He said, no. I was there when the CIA gave the briefing. The CIA said the Russians aren't bluffing. And the scariest part is that the Biden administration city officials in this briefing, senior officials, said, that's okay. We're ready for that. If they want a nuclear war, let's have one. That was the mindset of the Biden administration in November, December of last year. The CIA said there's a greater than 50% chance of there being a nuclear war. This is as bad as it gets. This is as dangerous as it gets. And yet the Americans walk through their lives oblivious to this reality. And here we are today with the United States and Russia continuing to have stress over Ukraine. The president of the United States recently responding to a tweet by former President Dmitry Medvedev. And all the tweet Medvedev did was responding to a tweet by Lindsey Graham that said, if Russia doesn't agree to a ceasefire, they need to ask the Ayatollah what regime change means, meaning we'll take out the Russian government. And Medvedev said, if you do that, remember, we have the dead hand, which is a system that if we launch a preemptive strike against Russia, they automatically fire all of their missiles against the United States. And so Trump went, well, I'm moving 2 nuclear submarines closer to Russia's shores, not understanding perhaps that that's the very scenario that leads to Russia believing a preemptive nuclear strike will exist. We're not out of the woods. I mean, we have stupidity taking place on a daily basis. The last remaining treaty that limits the size of both Russian and American strategic nuclear arsenals, the New START Treaty, expires on February 4th of next year. And if it's not extended, if there's not a new treaty, we will see a new arms race. That'll see 1,550 warheads immediately become 6,000, then 12,000, then 20,000 before the year is out. We'll be right back
And
to Cold
Scott,
War levels.
1,550 in your telling is already enough to end life as we know it.
400 is enough to end the world. 1,550 is just excessive.
So in some ways, the arms race. I don't mean to poo-poo the end of this treaty, but in some ways, it's kind of a moot point. If there is actually an escalation with as many nuclear bombs that exist right now.
But remember, we brought it down from 30,000. We brought it down from 30,000 to 1,550, and the goal is to continue to reduce, hopefully to zero. So we want to trend in the right direction. We don't want to reverse gears.
Certainly. I'm just speaking to the exigency at the moment. So, I mean, I want to ask you, because I've heard other people, foreign policy experts that I respect, say that basically the leveling force, the sort of mature, cooler head in the room has been over the last, 3 years or so, Putin. That's not the narrative in the Western media at large. Obviously, he's been characterized as wanting to have some kind of imperialistic takeover of all of Europe. We understand what the mainstream narrative is, but that in reality, the check against escalation, even as you described in this most recent anecdote, has been Putin. That being said, what you've described is also a world in which Putin would respond to America's deployment of these longer range missiles with a nuclear escalation. So how do you read that in your sort of characterization as of Putin being the sort of rational actor in the room? Is it just as a relative measure? And what is from Russia's perspective the end game of even that escalation? If again, of course, this is mutually assured destruction.
Well, let me answer the last part of your question first. Vladimir Putin
Sure.
has said on a number of occasions that a world without Russia is a world that nobody wants to live in. So if the United States' goal is to destroy Russia, then there won't be a world. So, that now we know where the Russians are. They're not going to allow the United States or anybody to destroy Russia. They will defend Russia and they will use all the weapons necessary. And the way you hold back the United States is by guaranteeing that if the United States seeks to destroy Russia, Russia will destroy the United States. And unfortunately, given the reality of nuclear weapons, that means destroying the world. It won't be Russia's fault, though, because they won't initiate the conflict. Let's just do a little history lesson here about Vladimir Putin. When Vladimir Putin became president on New Year's Eve, 1999, he had to win an election first. He did so in March of 2000. He won with 51.2%. All the people calling him a dictator don't understand that Russia is a functioning democracy. And, for his first several terms in office, it was a very difficult political struggle for him to stay in power. There was a lot of political opposition.
Can
At
I?
that time, he was
I'll come back to that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
at that time, he had to confront the reality of NATO expansion. And he told the United States and Europe, we don't support NATO expansion. He actually offered to join NATO. He said, if you're worried about us, why not bring us into the alliance? And therefore, we're part of the same team. But that's not how NATO expansion works. NATO expansion works because they're trying to justify increased military budgets by painting Russia as the enemy, not as their friend. So we never
Mm.
wanted to be friends with Russia, and this sinks into the psyche of the Russians. In 2005, Vladimir Putin gave a speech to the Federal Assembly in which he said the greatest tragedy of the past century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And everybody jumped on that saying, see, he just wants to bring back the Soviet Union. They never listened to the rest of the statement. He said, because overnight, tens of millions of Russians became homeless. He said, I am the president of not just the Russian Federation, but the Russian nation, the Russian people. And the Russian people are defined by common history, language, culture, religion. And he said, I have to protect these people. I have to defend these people. Um, and therefore, NATO expansion into places like Ukraine threatens this because there are Russians there who, Putin's responsible for. So he said that in 2007, he went and spoke at Munich. It's one of the greatest speeches given in modern times by anybody. Everybody should read this speech where he put the West on notice, saying, we've tried to work with you. We want to live in peace, but look at what you've done. You've invaded Iraq in violation of international law. Are you aware of what you have done? You're expanding NATO, threatening us. Are you aware of what you've done? We want to live in peace, but we're not going to sit here and allow this to happen. In 2002, the United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, one of the foundational treaties of arms control that have been in place since 1972, that creates the perception of mutually assured destruction, meaning if you use nuclear weapons and we all die, therefore let's not use nuclear weapons. But we got rid of the ABM treaty because we wanted to build a missile shield, which said we can shoot down your missiles and you can't shoot down ours. Therefore, we have supremacy. And Putin's like, this isn't going to end well, guys. We want equality. We don't want to give you supremacy. This led to Russia beginning to modernize its nuclear arsenal so that it could defeat any ballistic missile shield that we produced. And today, Russia has the most modern nuclear weapons in the world. In 2019, Donald Trump withdrew from the INF treaty, my treaty, the one that creates stability in Europe. He got rid of it. And now we're deploying INF systems. What has Russia done? They had a moratorium that said they won't develop weapons as long as the United States doesn't deploy weapons into Europe. We did. Now we have the Oreshnik missile, which is a very destabilizing missile that Russia had no choice but to build to respond to the threats of the United States. Russia's not the one creating the problems. Russia's reacting to the problems created by the United States, by Europe, by the expansion of NATO. President Trump himself has admitted at least 3 times this year and many times previously that this war in Ukraine came about because of NATO expansion, that Russia had a right to be concerned about that. So, yes, Russia has taken measures to defend Russian interests, but the reality is Russia's only responding to the provocations of the West. If we stop provoking Russia, I think Russia wants to live in peace and harmony. They're not looking for a fight, but they're not going to run away from one, and they darn sure aren't going to bend the knee.
So what does that mean for contemporary negotiations to end the conflict? I mean, Trump famously said prior to winning the election last year that he could end the conflict within 24 hours. Of course, folks are, who have been longtime critics of him are doing victory laps, talking about how empty that promise and commitment was, especially because in the last day or so, as of us recording this, he made a similar promise about ending the conflict in Gaza.
I mean, I deal with Bibi Netanyahu quite a bit, and we had great success, obviously, in Iran. We knocked out their nuclear threat. That would have been a horror show having them have a nuclear weapon. They would have used it, too. We did very well there. Right now they're talking about Gaza City. There's always talking about something. At some point it's going to get settled. And I'm saying you better get it settled soon. You have to get it settled soon. And that means, nobody can forget October 7th. People forget October 7th. That was one of the most brutal. I've seen some terrible things, some brutal things. That was about as bad as it gets. And nobody can forget that. With that being said, it's got to get over with. It's got to get over with because between the hunger and all of the other problems, worse than hunger, death, pure death, people being killed. And, I'm the one that brought back the hostages, and I did it with that gentleman right there, Steve Witkoff, and with Marco. All of us, the whole team, we worked together. Even the trade people worked on it with us. And we brought back a lot of the hostages. Now we're left with, would you say 20, Steve, or would you say it's less than 20?
I hope it's 20.
He hopes it's 20 because some could be dead. That's what he means, I assume.
Yes.
So we have 20, but there's rumors that some could be dead. It's a terrible situation over there. Terrible, terrible situation. But it's coming to a head. It's coming to an end. We are sending, we sent $60 million of food over there just recently. And I don't even know if people know it. We distributed ourselves. We're giving a lot of food, spending a lot of money on food, getting it over there. We have a lot of food. We have a lot of oil, and we have the greatest farmers in the world. So we have a lot of food, but we're sending a lot of it over to Gaza, and we're feeding a lot of people. But with all of that being said, it's a lot of people to feed. And I think that we will have, within the next 2 to 3 weeks, you're going to have pretty good conclusive a conclusive ending. It's a hard thing to say because they've been fighting for thousands of years. If you want to know, that's been a hotbed forever. But I think we're doing a very good job. But it does have to end. But people can't forget October 7th either.
It seems as though, certainly when he was running for office, when he was out of power, Trump made a lot of commitments that were anti-war in nature, saying that he didn't want all this endless spending for Ukraine, saying that he wanted to end this conflict, saying that, criticizing Joe Biden's funding of the conflict, et cetera, and touting his good relationship with Putin to bring it to an end. He also articulated, as you just pointed out, that Ukraine shared responsibility for the start of the war, characterizing it as provoking the war, et cetera. That being said, what do you make of the inability to negotiate at this time? If Trump genuinely does sincerely believe and agree with what mainstream American media obviously characterizes as Putin's framing of the conflict, what is the core cause of the difficulty in bringing it to a close?
Well, first of all, what Trump is proposing through a ceasefire and continued existence of this current Ukrainian regime doesn't bring the conflict to a close. It just brings it to a temporary halt. It creates the conditions. Indeed, it makes it absolutely certain that down the road there will be additional conflicts because Ukraine, under the Zelensky-Zaluzhny type leadership, will never accept Russian ownership of Crimea or the Donbass or Zaporizhia or Kherson. And so all you do is you buy time for NATO to re-equip the Ukrainian army, and there will be a war down there. And Russia says, we're not doing that. We're going to resolve the root causes of this conflict, which means they're going to fundamentally transform the reality of Ukraine. And this is the Russian goal and objective. This is what demilitarization means. This is what denazification means. And Trump doesn't comprehend this because he has advisors who hate Russia. I think Donald Trump's the only person, maybe with the exception of J.D. Vance, on his team that actually wants peace with Russia. Marco Rubio doesn't. Look at Marco Rubio's history. He hates Russia. He despises Russia. Pete Hegseth is a cold warrior who has nothing good to say about Russia. Keith Kellogg is just a man he was given a medal by the Ukrainian president yesterday, which tells you everything you need to know about Keith Kellogg. Trump's inner circle doesn't want peace with Russia. They recognize that the president has made a commitment and they have to be seen as supporting the president's commitment, but they're stabbing him behind the back every step of the way. But the ultimate reality is that Trump doesn't understand that Russia's not looking. He thinks that somehow Russia's losing this war, that Vladimir Putin's looking for a way out. He says that over and over again. Putin wants an end to this war. Putin does want an end to this war when Russia wins. I just came back from Russia, and I'm telling you right now, the theme that resonates throughout Russia is peace through victory, meaning that there can't be peace without victory, and victory is defined by solving the root causes of this conflict. Ukraine will not be allowed to have an 800,000 strong NATO trained army. They will have 50,000 strong light border guard force. That's it. Russia will dictate that outcome. Ukraine won't be allowed to have their current government, which is heavily influenced by the neo-Nazi ideology of the Banderists, who date back to Stepan Bandera, who was an ally of Adolf Hitler, killed tens of thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Russians and Poles and Ukrainians, a mass murderer who today is now considered a national hero of Ukraine. Lest you think I'm exaggerating, there's a video that came out of Odessa the other day on Ukrainian National Day, and there were parades of Nazis, literally wearing Nazi uniforms, flying Nazi flags, and giving the Nazi sign as they march through Odessa. And this happens over and over. Russia says this will not be allowed to happen. We fought a war against Nazi ideology, and we're not going to allow it to be reborn right next door. That's what denazification is, neutrality. It means total neutrality, not the neutrality where NATO peacekeepers are on the ground inside Europe. How neutral can you be when you have French and British NATO members on your soil? Russia won't allow that happen. Trump has yet to embrace this reality. He continues to believe that he can impose a peace on Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin will not accept anything other than total victory. And this has been the Russian position from day one.
So earlier, you, I think, correctly, to my mind, asked how should Russia respond? How should Putin respond when Lloyd Austin, when the United States is framing the objective as destabilizing Russia, defeating Russia, weakening Russia, as opposed to, winning back whatever territory or protecting Ukrainian sovereignty or some more legitimate goal. I think you were right when you say, well, what is a country supposed to do? How is it supposed to respond to that sort of a threat? What if someone were to ask the same question from the perspective of Ukraine? Nazis and Azov battalions and stuff to the side, substantive judgments on what's going on in Ukraine to the side. What if someone says, well, obviously Ukrainians aren't going to accept the idea of not having their own sort of political autonomy. And if the only resolution to this is peace through victory, and Ukraine doesn't have the ability militarily to defeat Russia, quite obviously. I mean, what do you say to someone who thinks it's asymmetrical to accept that Ukraine should be happy with that outcome and shouldn't want the support of the West so that it can meaningfully challenge Russia, while Russia had every right to reject the idea that it should sit and twiddle its thumbs while the West was trying to weaken it in its autonomy?
Well, again, to answer that question, we have to define the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. It didn't begin on February 24th, 2022. It didn't begin in February of 2014 with the U.S. CIA-backed Maidan revolution that overthrew the constitutionally elected presidency of Viktor Yanukovych. It didn't begin in 2004 with the CIA-backed color revolution, again, designed to remove Viktor Yanukovych from power. It didn't begin in 1991 when Ukraine declared its independence. It goes back to 1946 when the CIA began to use the forces of Stepan Bandera, Western Ukrainian nationalists, as a vehicle to undermine the Soviet Union. The United States has been using Ukraine as a tool against Russia since the end of the Second World War. This is a reality. The CIA is declassified the documents to prove this. The CIA acknowledges that they were paying these Banderists, these Western Ukrainian nationalists, to undermine the Soviet Union up until 1990. And after that, they didn't need to pay them because now they were in power. They owned the Ukrainian government. But Ukraine has a significant Russian-speaking population. And I mentioned to you that Vladimir Putin says he is responsible to defend the Russian people. In 2004, Viktor Yanukovych, who is a Russian-speaking politician, won the presidency. But this was against the desires of the European Union, the United States, and we annulled those elections, had a new election. Yanukovych won. Then against the Constitution of Ukraine, we had a third election where we brought in somebody who was Yushchenko. First thing Yushchenko did is elevate Stepan Bandera to be the hero of Ukraine. And the Russians were like, you can't do this. So they began a struggle. They changed the education system. They started to culturally erase Russia. They made it evil to be Russia. They started teaching the kids to hate Russia, to hate Moscow. Some vicious racial slurs developed during this period of time. In 2010, Yanukovych won the election, came back into power, and started to push back. But this led to 2014, the Maidan, where the CIA and European Union said, we're done with these Russian speakers. They overthrew him, and then they declared war on the ethnic Russians of Crimea, of Odessa. You've heard about the burning of the trade building in Odessa, 48 dead, burned to death for the sin of being Russian. They tried to take over Crimea. The Russians wouldn't allow it. They took it. They made a move on the Donbass. They bombed civilians. The tanks went in and ran over civilians. The civilians rose up and said, we won't be part of this. First, they just said, we want to have federalization. We don't want to be independent of Ukraine, but we need a Ukraine that respects our rights. Ukraine wouldn't do that. They declared them to be terrorists. They launched an anti-terrorist operation. They began to bomb Ukrainian children. You remember Poroshenko, the president, giving a speech where he said, our children will go to school and enjoy the sunlight. Your children will live in the basements in fear because we're going to bomb you. This was a reality. They slaughtered the children of the Donbass. They slaughtered the civilians. So the Russians intervened. The Minsk Accords came in 2014, 2015. They came in because the Russian separatists surrounded the Ukrainian army at Debaltsevoye, a village in the Donetsk Republic. They were going to kill all the Ukrainian soldiers because Ukrainian soldiers have been killing the civilians. Angela Merkel begged Vladimir Putin, begged him, don't do this. Stop it. Let's look for peace. And Putin said yes. He prevented the slaughter of the Ukrainian army, brought it out, and then came the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords gave these territories to Ukraine. Russia wasn't trying to take the territories away. Russia just wanted the rights of the Russian-speaking people to be respected. And for 8 years, the Minsk Accords went forward. Ukraine, Germany, and France, the signatories on this, refused to advance it. Why? Well, we now know. They admit it was all a sham. They were buying time so that NATO could retrain the Ukrainian army, so the Ukrainian army could complete the mission of kicking the Russians out of the Donbass. This is the reality. When Joe Biden met with Vladimir Putin in Geneva in June of 2021, Biden's was like, why are you moving Russian troops along the border? He said, well, because the Ukrainians are threatening to attack the Donbass. He said, if you don't want us to move troops, then you need to implement Minsk. Biden promised him that he would direct Tony Blinken to implement Minsk. What happened? That was in June. In September, Blinken was meeting with NATO officials to send weaponry into Ukraine secretly, offensive weaponry, because we had no intention of allowing Minsk to be implemented. We didn't want peace, the peace that Putin wanted. And then what happened is they turned around. The Russians confronted the British or the French and the Germans in October and said, are you going to do Minsk? They said, no, we're not. We're not going to force the Ukrainians to do that. Then Russia shifted gears, not to go to war, but to seek a peace treaty. They drafted up a treaty that was given to the United States and NATO on December 17th, 2021, that talked about a new European security framework. All they wanted was guarantees to protect the Russian speakers. Even then, the United States and NATO wouldn't agree to that, and this led to the conflict in 2024. So you say, Russia. Understand, Russia's been looking for peace nonstop. This war was thrust upon Russia. Russia didn't attack unilaterally. Russia responded because Ukraine massed 80,000 troops on the border with Donetsk and began shelling, a tenfold increase in artillery shelling between up until the moment of the Russian action. Russia acted in self-defense, collective self-defense with Donetsk and Lugansk. This is the reality. And so you say, what should Russia do? Trust the West? Russia's done nothing but to try to trust the West, to get the West to agree to a reasonable peace. It's the West that's betrayed Russia. So Russia's tired of this. They want to solve this problem once and for all. And the problem is Ukraine. The problem is that Ukraine has sold its sovereignty to the West.
So walk me through the resolution of this, or perhaps more accurately framed, walk me through the theater of what happened between Putin and Trump and Alaska? Because I'm having a difficult time sort of negotiating this idea or parsing this idea that Trump, given, left to his own devices, if he had his druthers, would allow for the denazification, would, allow for the demilitarization, would basically withdraw funding and support from Ukraine so that Ukraine didn't have a choice in the matter. And then that would bring the conflict to a close. But for the people who surround him / international pressures from Europe, this conflict would be resolved. You do really place the onus on everyone else in his orbit? Do you feel like Trump has that much kind of knowledge and agency? And absent that scenario that I just described coming to fruition, because there are all these other actors who don't want that to be the case, how do you see this ultimately being resolved?
Well, we know that Donald Trump, if you remember, even on the airplane to Alaska, he spoke to the reporters and he said, if Putin doesn't agree to a ceasefire from the very beginning, I'm out of there. This meeting's over, and there will be horrible consequences for Vladimir Putin.
I want certain things. I want to see a ceasefire. This is not to do with Europe. Europe's not telling me what to do. But they're going to be involved in the process, obviously, as will Zelensky. But I want to see a ceasefire rapidly. I don't know if it's going to be today, but I'm not going to be happy if it's not today. Everyone said it can't be today, but I'm just saying I want the killing to stop. I'm in this to stop the killing. We're not putting up any money. We're making money. They're buying our weapons, and we're sending them to NATO, and NATO's sending us big, beautiful checks. But I don't care about that. I care about it was a big factor when Biden spent $350 billion and got nothing. But what I do care about is they lost last week 7,011 people were lost, almost all soldiers. 36 people in a town which got hit by a missile, but over 7,000 soldiers. It's crazy.
Could you describe a little bit, Mr. President, because I know you've had a lot of phone calls with President Putin. What's the difference in a face-to-face, in-person meeting?
Look, he's a smart guy, been doing it for a long time, but so have I. Been doing it for a long time. And here we are with President. That was much more difficult than what I'm doing today, believe me.
You remember that. I mean, it's public.
Sure.
And yet what happened? Putin landed, they had a very short meeting, and Trump immediately changed his tune. He said, no, we're not looking for a ceasefire. We're looking for a comprehensive peace agreement that solves the root causes of this conflict.
All of us would obviously prefer an immediate ceasefire while we work on a lasting peace, and maybe something like that could happen. As of this moment, it's not happening, but President Zelensky and President Putin can talk a little bit more about that. In the 6 or so wars that we stopped, we haven't had a ceasefire. And so I don't know that it's necessary. You can do it through the war, but it would be, I like the ceasefire from another standpoint. You immediately stop the killing. But I believe a peace agreement at the end of all of this is something that's very attainable, and it can be done in the near future. With all of the wars that I got involved in, we only have this one left. Of course, as I walk out the door, there'll probably be a new one starting, and I'll get that stopped too. But I thought this was going to be one of the easier ones. It's actually one of the most difficult. They're very complex.
That's Vladimir Putin.
So you think what the chest beating on the plane was what? For the benefit of his advisors?
I think that Trump has a lot of political enemies who don't want him to succeed on Russia. They exist within his inner circle. They exist in the Republican Party, Lindsey Graham. They exist.
It feels bipartisan. It feels
bipartisan opposition.
It's the bipartisan war machine that wants an ongoing conflict
100%.
with Russia for the reason that it always has. But go ahead.
Yeah, Trump has to play political games, so he says things to mollify, to pacify the crowd. But then, when push comes to shove and he meets Putin, he has to change his position. But even now, he has to continue to walk a thin line because there's a midterm election coming up, and he can't give his opposition free ammunition. And so he needs to be playing the game as if he's standing tough on certain things.
I don't think you need a ceasefire. If you look at the 6 deals that I settled this year, they were all at war. I didn't do any ceasefires. And I know that it might be good to have, but I can also understand strategically why, well, one country or the other wouldn't want it. You have a ceasefire and they rebuild and rebuild and rebuild, and, maybe they don't want that. But if you look at the 6 deals that we made peace and long-term, long-running wars, I didn't do any ceasefires. Would I like the concept. I like the concept of a ceasefire for one reason, because you'd stop killing people immediately, as opposed to in 2 weeks or 1 week or whatever it takes. But we can work a deal where we're working on a peace deal while they're fighting. They have to fight. I wish they could stop. I'd like them to stop. But strategically, that could be a disadvantage for one side or the other. But all of these deals I made without even the mention of the words ceasefire.
But we know what the outcome is going to be. Russia's going to win completely, and Trump is going to withdraw from the process. The strategic objective for Trump is peace with Russia, not a Ukrainian victory or preserving Ukrainian, sovereignty. I think at the end of the day, Russia will achieve what it wants to achieve in Ukraine. This will be very bloody because Ukraine will fight till the bitter end, supported by Europe. But it will be a decisive Russian victory, and the United States will accept this outcome, and then we'll move forward with Russia to work on strategic. I mean, you just heard President Trump today say it's important. We have to talk about nuclear weapons. We have to prevent a nuclear war. He wants better economic relations. He wants good relations in the Arctic. He wants to be able to work with Russia on these rare earth minerals. He's tired of being beholden to the Chinese on permanent magnets. So I think Putin and Trump understand that U.S.-Russian relations are far more important than Europe getting its way in Ukraine. There's a political game that has to be played, but ultimately, I think Trump is going to facilitate the Russian victory because he has no choice. He has no other alternative other than war. And if this president becomes a war president against Russia, he'll lose the midterm elections.
I mean, there's an argument that he is a war president, right? There's a version of an argument that's coming from the left that says even prior to him becoming president that we shouldn't be overly trustful of Donald Trump's claims that he wants to cut funding to Ukraine, et cetera. The Republican Party was kind of divided on this fact, but there was certainly more quote unquote anti-war, anti-funding Ukraine arguments on the right than there were at the left. But that being said, many leftists were of the view that this could be a rhetorical position that's taken to distinguish oneself from Joe Biden, to tap into a genuine sort of America First anti-war sentiment that was happening on a bipartisan way throughout the country and juiced up by frustration with our funding of Israel and all of these things. And that, in fact, when he came into office, we weren't going to see much different between Biden and Trump in terms of how they litigated these conflicts or funded these conflicts. And certainly that's been the case with Israel-Palestine. And while there are these rhetorical gestures that I take your point that you point to, I don't know if it's even useful to believe that they are from Trump's organic commitments or not, if the reality is that the war machine has historically been too powerful to allow whatever thoughts and feelings, heart and soul, wishes, dreams, and commitments of any given person who got into the White House to come to fruition. And on top of that, there's an argument that says, while Republicans will sometimes support an end to one conflict, it's because they are simply turning their eye to a different part of the world. So talking about ramping down in Ukraine doesn't mean we're going to turn off the military industrial spigot. We're just saying we're going to regroup and refocus on Taiwan. We have different priorities. And so also that's part of my reluctance to sort of accept any narrative that would say, well, Donald Trump really doesn't want this to happen. He just is being bullied by the warmongers in his midst. What do you say to that?
It's a valid argument. I can't sit here and say this is crazy, but what I will say is this, the alternative is nuclear war. And so to have Donald Trump meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska is pretty good, even though it wasn't the perfect meeting, even though there's inconsistencies in his argument.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. That was very profound. And I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones, that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. We're going to try and get this over with. We really made some great progress today. I've always had a fantastic relationship with President Putin, with Vladimir.
I'd say that's a heck of a lot better than having nuclear weapons being fired. Remember, 50% chance of nuclear conflict last.
Well, sure, but is there no longer? I mean, where does that number come from? Are we no longer? Because I've heard this kind of the doomsday clock, we're seconds from midnight for a while now, and it's provoked by different circumstances. But are we any farther from midnight now than we were in November when this CIA prediction was made?
But Joe Biden wouldn't talk to Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump is talking to Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump, when he met with the 7 leaders of Europe, stopped their meeting so he could call Vladimir Putin and talk to him. We're talking to the Russians. I'd say that's pretty darn good. Are we safer today? No, it's a very dangerous situation, but talking is better than shooting. And right now, the president of the United States and the president of Russia are talking to one another. They are talking about a positive future, not one predicated on the necessity of conflict, but one that avoids conflict. Do I believe that Donald Trump is sincere? I don't know. I mean, this is not a perfect man. He doesn't have a track record which makes reading the tea leaves of what the future is going to look like easy. There's much about Donald Trump that I hate. If you've been following me at all, you know that I say some very harsh things about Donald Trump. And I'm very critical. For instance, on Israel, it's unforgivable what he's doing with Gaza. I can't forgive him for that. But on this issue, I believe he is sincere. I can't have absolute faith, meaning I can't sit here and put my hand on the Bible and say Donald Trump's 100% committed, because you bring up very many good points. But I will say that there's consistency to his argument, that he is pursuing a peaceful resolution of this problem that brings stability to the U.S.-Russian relationship. But I will also say this. Vladimir Putin, as you alluded to earlier, I believe he's the adult in the room. I think he's been the stabilizing force. Over the years, I've learned a couple things about the Russians. Words matter to them. They don't say words lightly. When they say something, it's because they believe it and they're going to act on it. And they also aren't given to false hope. So for Vladimir Putin to make the commitment he has to Donald Trump, to work with Donald Trump, means that the Russians see something here. Because the Russians aren't about going off tilting at windmills. They don't believe in fantasy. They're very reality-based people. And right now, they could easily just disengage from Donald Trump and say, no, we're going to build Fortress Russia and come hell or come high water, if we want. So I believe in the peace process.
My impression was that it's a little bit what has happened after the mid-August meeting, which was that there was some question as to, are there going to be follow-up meetings? And the Russian response was, well, when you have something legitimate to come to the table with. But if what we're talking about is, you just want a ceasefire for the sake of a ceasefire without getting to these underlying things, well, then no, there's no, it depends on what the agenda is, basically. The question of whether or not we're going to reconvene.
There's 2 tracks here. There's a Ukraine track, and then there's the U.S.-Russian relation track. And I think what we're seeing is that Donald Trump's going to unplug from the Ukraine track and focus on the U.S.-Russian relationship track to get strategic nuclear arms talks back up to speed, to talk about joint work in the Arctic, to talk about economic investments. But Ukraine is an anchor around both of their heads. They have to cut that chain, and that's going to take some effort.
I mean, do those tracks reconverge if so? Correct me if I'm wrong, but there has been some divestment from U.S. funding for Ukraine. Trump has said he's not going to give direct funding anymore. Is that right?
We're not giving the Ukrainians money. We make the Europeans pay.
Okay, so we're making the Europeans pay. I understand that's a good sort of political point for those folks who are America first, more for sort of like tax dollar spending reasons as opposed to geopolitical or like sort of ethical reasons in Gaza or whatever. But constructively speaking, if NATO does pay for these things, if long range weapons are being provided to Ukraine and they are escalating in the way Russia has said could trigger a nuclear response, doesn't that get us right back to this exact same place? America, a few coins heavier in the pocket, but ultimately that's not the stakes here, right?
Right, but let's parse this out.
Sure, please.
First of all, Russia is winning decisively on the battlefield. The Ukrainian army is in a state of collapse as we speak.
Yeah.
There is no effective Ukrainian air defense anymore, which means Russia has free reign in terms of striking strategic targets. So Ukraine can't stop that. One of the things that Trump talked about earlier was that we were going to prioritize air defense for Ukraine, but the United States wouldn't provide these weapons. They have to be bought by Europe. And so now we have nations lining up to say we're going to buy air defense for Ukraine. They won't be ready until 2027, 2028. It's 2025. So even though Trump talks about, oh, we're going to be providing weapon systems to Europe to provide to Ukraine, they're not going to be delivered to Ukraine for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. The war will be over by then. It's the same thing with these long-range missiles, the ERAM missiles, the extended range attack munition. I don't know what the AM stands for, but these are weapons that were conceived in 2023 and 2024. They don't exist. And so now they've had to turn from conception into field trials to have a weapon that's ready to be produced. And today, I guess the ERAM is ready to be produced, but they haven't begun production. They haven't begun serial production. Now they're talking about maximum output of 1,000 missiles a year. Trump said, we're going to sell 3,650 to the Ukrainians. These missiles don't exist right now. First of all, in order to get to 1,000 a year, we need a full commitment for multi-year production. That means that Europe's going to have to pony up all the money up front. Europe doesn't have any money. Germany's going bankrupt as we speak. They don't have any money. Nobody has any money. Where's this money going to come from? And without that upfront funding, you can't get the full production capacity. So the number of missiles that will be provided to Ukrainians 6 weeks from now, and trust me, the ground truth is going to be completely different in 6 weeks. You won't recognize the battlefield. It'll have been transformed. Ukraine will have been struck even harsher. This is an empty gesture by Donald Trump, just like air defense. It's a political move to be seen as being tough, as supporting Ukraine, but it is not supporting Ukraine. It's setting Ukraine up for failure. Moreover, it's setting Europe for failure because it's requiring Europe to commit resources that it should be using to shore up their failing economies, but instead they're using it to buy weapons that will never be delivered to Ukraine. And even if these weapons are delivered to Ukraine, the use of these weapons, the targeting of these weapons, can only happen if the United States says, yes, we approve that target. You really think Donald Trump, knowing what the Russian nuclear doctrine is going to say, yeah, go ahead and strike that target in there? No.
I thought I just saw Zelensky saying now that we're not using American weapons, we don't have to get their permission to target things. What was he referring to when he was talking about that?
These are Ukrainian-made, well, they're British weapons, British design weapons, German design weapons, but they're firing these weapons into Russia. Understand that these weapons don't change anything. Yeah, it's a big propaganda victory for Ukraine to show an oil depot blowing up outside of St. Petersburg. Say, look, we struck that place. It doesn't change the outcome. Russia's still winning on the battlefield, and watch what happens the next couple nights. Mark my word, Russia's going to flatten Ukraine.
You're saying that we're currently in the middle of a sort of a turning point in the battle. I mean, we've known for years now that Ukraine has been taking defeats, that it's just poorly matched. The death toll is insane. What 1.7 million Ukrainians dead? I mean, yeah. It's remarkable, frankly, to me that the scale of this isn't plastered everywhere and much more front of mind, frankly, given how sympathetic. Yeah, the media is very sympathetic to Ukraine, yet doesn't want to talk about Ukraine's losses when it wants to frame it as not failing as much as it did. And the asymmetry there is really sort of fascinating, especially when juxtaposed with the opposite being true in the reporting of Gaza. But so you're saying that there's something that's shifting, some low point that Ukraine is approaching in the next couple of days or weeks?
When the Russians intervened, began the military phase of this through the initiation of the special military operation, the invasion of Ukraine. Their goal was simple: to get Ukraine to the negotiating table. There was no territorial ambition. And we see the proof of this in the Istanbul communique that was successfully negotiated, only to be withdrawn under pressure by the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson when he visited Ukraine at the end of March, early April of 2022. The Russians said, we're going to withdraw. And they began withdrawing. They withdrew from around Kiev. They withdrew around Sumy. They withdrew from Chernihiv. They began 50% withdrawal out of Kharkov. But what did the West do? We told the Ukrainians no, and then we gave them $48 billion, tanks, munitions. We trained up a new army, and they attacked the Russians. So that led to a second phase of the thing where Russia said, okay, now we're going to physically take control of the Donbass. But then the Ukrainians attacked again. And this time the Russians mobilized 300,000 and said the objectives of the war have changed. We're now going to take the Donbass and Kherson and Zaporizhia. They've changed the dynamic. This, though, required. Have you ever gone on a cruise ship?
Yes, senior year.
Yeah. Okay. So you know once
Spring
that
break.
ship starts going, it doesn't maneuver quickly. It starts going.
Sure.
In order to turn, it has to gradually begin to turn, and it takes a while for it to make that turn, and then it finally gets going, and then it builds up momentum, and it goes. In 2023, the Russians began turning the ship away from one objective to a new objective. It's through a war of attrition to wear the Ukrainians down, because they're not just fighting the Ukrainians. This is the fifth time Russia's destroyed the Ukrainian army. The fifth time. Why do you think 1.7 million? Where did that come from? Because Russia's destroyed the Ukrainian army 5 times. And it's continuing to be rebuilt by the West, who is more than happy to have Ukrainians die. We give them the tanks and everything. So Russia's in the process of destroying the 6th Ukrainian army as we speak. But that Russian ship has made that turn. It's now changed direction, and there ain't nothing going to stop it. We're past the turning point. The turning point was earlier this summer when Vladimir Putin told the Ukrainians, we will give you terms of conflict termination. The Istanbul communique that you agreed upon back in March of 2022, modified to reflect the reality that Kherson, Zaporizhia, and the Donbass will forever be part of Russia. If you accept this, the war can come to an end. Ukraine wouldn't accept it. Then Russia began making that turn. Now Russia's
That's also with the demilitarization and the denazification that you mentioned.
Oh yeah, no,
earlier.
that's part of the Istanbul communique. Was always part of that. The Ukrainians agreed to it back then. That's why you see Zelensky throwing a temper tantrum. We will never do this. Well, that's what you agreed to back in March, because you understood the reality of the Russian position. But that was also in March. The Russians had only destroyed the Ukrainian army 1 time. Today, they've destroyed it 5 times.
I mean, do you feel, not to world's tiniest violin or what have you, but do you have some, I don't know, sympathy is maybe not the best word, but my understanding of it was that Zelensky basically was strong-armed by the West out of taking that compromise, and was told that it had the support and backing of the West to continue to fight with Russia, with the West's goal of weakening Russia. And there's an argument that says, well, they have a reliance interest. We've left them high and dry. And now, it's there's a kind of like a legitimate, you describe as him freaking out. Like there's a legitimate freak out. There's a legitimate crash out to have been told, sacrifice your people for all of these years. We'll have your back. We can fight this to the last Ukrainian. And then getting someone like Trump to says, never mind, we're going to pull out. Not to say that the goal is a good goal, but the kind of emotional response, the kind of sunk cost fallacy of it all weighing heavily on Zelensky in Ukraine.
I used to have sympathy, not for Zelensky. I despise the man. He's a man who ran on promise of, when he ran for election, said he would go on his knees and beg Vladimir Putin not to have a war. He said, let the Russians speak the Russian language. Why are we trying? He's a man who said, I want peace. And then immediately becoming elected president, held a war council that said, we will invade the Donbass. We will crush these Russians. We will crush the Moscow.
Why? What do you think changed?
Nothing changed. That's the reality of Ukraine. This is the point I've been trying to make. Ukraine is not an innocent party here. Ukraine has been trained to hate Russians for decades now. They have multiple generations of people who despise the Russians.
To Zelensky as a sort of a politician, do you think he just always planned the bait and switch? Do you think the reality of getting into office and the political pressures changed him?
Is a man who allowed himself to be used by oligarchs who were beholden to the British. He's a British intelligence operative. They've been controlling him from day one, MI6. And he's also a man that, when he became president, ran into the Azov unit, the Nazis, who went up to him and said, if you make peace with Russia, if you allow the Minsk Accords to go through, we will hang you by the neck on that telephone pole. This is a public statement. They threatened the president of Ukraine that if he sought peace with Russia, the Minsk Accords, they would hang him by the neck. That's the power the Nazis have over the Ukrainian government. So Zelensky folded, and he then became a hardcore war president. But you say, okay, but what about the Ukrainian people? You do know from the very beginning they were taking Russian speakers and wrapping them with saran wrap on telephone poles. You've seen that, haven't you? Where they pull down their pants, they paint their face green, and then people go by and spit at them and slap them. That's how they treat Russians. They burn them to death in Odessa. They shell the Russian children. They murder them. I just spoke with a girl. She's not a girl, she's 31, but at the time she was 21 years old, and she would go in there to rescue children from the destroyed homes. Their parents are dead. She would pull the children, the wounded children out, take them out. She tried to take them to Kiev and say, Ukraine, take care of these. The Ukrainians declared her a terrorist. So instead, she took them to Russia. They were given medical care. Instead, the Russians recorded the names, tried to return them to Ukrainian parents if they were alive, tried to return to Ukraine if Ukraine wanted them. And what did the Ukrainians do? They accused the Russians of kidnapping Ukrainian children. The narrative we've been fed in the West is 100% a lie. And so I have no sympathy for the Ukrainian people today. They wanted this war. They cheered on this war, and now they got this war, and they're going to pay the price.
So I appreciate your argument. I'm just trying to get, and I hope you understand that I'm trying to moot this out. I want to make sure I understand.
Oh, you're doing your job. You're doing a great job, by the way. So.
And I just, in the same way that I reject the sort of simplistic framing of Putin as an ogre who wants to take over Europe, I just am trying to understand the sort of either interpersonal or geopolitical or like financial or whatever it is motivations of all of these actors here with an eye toward anticipating the closure. Because I will say, whenever you talk about the kind of denazification and demilitarization, I reflect on a little salon I was invited to with a lot of lefty thinkers shortly after the conflict had started in 2022, with a lot of like sort of anti-war type voices in the room, you know, journalists from The Intercept and Matt Dust and, you know, these kinds of types. And in that room, a few months after, I think it was like spring or summer of 2022, the idea of even giving 1 mile of Ukrainian territory to Russia was, even in that space, framed by most people in the room as like, you're bending the knee to Putin, right? Even that kind of like the most de minimis territorial concession. And so now being in a place where, because the cruise ship has turned, the consequences are much bigger, and also raises these questions that I feel very ambivalent about with respect to self-determination and national borders, and what even my commitments to any of that are as a progressive. You know, I'm struggling with what feels, for lack of a better word, fair or right. There is a part of me that's like, I don't care about borders. I don't care about nationalism. I think that they're more trouble than they're worth. It doesn't actually matter what country these areas belong to, so long as they have self-determination and democracy and freedom of movement and substantive rights and all those kinds of things. But there is a part of me that also appreciates that nations have their own interests and can often dress them up in claims about the rights of people in territories that they want, because they also have strategic or resource advantages and all of these kinds of things. I don't want to be naive either. It can be true, all of the things that you said, and I believe that it is true, everything that you're saying about the Russian-speaking people of the Donbass and their poor treatment in the context of Ukraine. And also that Russia, like every world power, has its own independent agenda. And how do you parse that when also you happen to be someone who is not overly committed, LOL, to the idea of borders to begin with? Do you know what I mean?
Right, but neither is Russia.
Yeah.
Russia's not committed to war. Again, this is the point I'm trying to make. Russia respected the 1991 borders of Ukraine throughout. I mean, Russia committed to that in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. As long as Ukraine...
But now you're saying that because the cruise ship cannot be returned.
No, but Ukraine had to remain neutral. The whole thing about the security guarantees is that we're talking about a neutral Ukraine. But when Ukraine decides they want to join NATO, that's no longer a neutral. So now Russia's saying we
Sure.
still have a problem. But even after Ukraine made an effort to make the move, Russia said we won't allow that to happen. But Russia never said we're taking over the territory. Even after the horrific crimes against the people of the Donbass, the Minsk Accords weren't about Russia taking over territory. It was about Russia respecting the rights of the Russian people. Russia never made a territorial move. When you had your meetings with those people in the summer of 2022, what
Yeah.
you had was Russophobic propaganda, because the reality is Russia,
Yeah.
even with the Minsk Accord, I mean, with the at that time, Russia had committed to the 1991 borders, or actually the 2014 borders, because Crimea was Russia, never going to change. But Russia said, we don't want the Donbass. It's yours. Zaporizhia, Kherson is yours. So it only
Yeah.
happened that Russia changed its mind after they were betrayed an additional time. And then Russia said, we have no choice at this point, because NATO now has thrown its weight in behind Ukraine, that we will protect the Russian people by absorbing them into Mother Russia. And that's what Russia did. And that ship
Maybe
ain't
what I'm
turning.
misunderstanding is, or maybe it would help to clarify things for me if I understood better. Because it seems to me, if it is the case that no longer being a part of NATO, which I understand to be a core condition, also just happens to mean the demilitarization, because the military that exists is NATO military, and that whatever existed of Ukraine's sort of independent military reserves has already been wiped out, to your point, 5 times over, then that makes a certain amount of sense to me. It's not that I'm asking you to not have your own independent infrastructure and means of defense, the way, for example, Gaza has been told you can't even have an airport, you don't get control over your shipping ways, you can't have a pier, et cetera. You can't control your own water resources. That's not what we're talking about. We're just saying, as a consequence of no longer being a part of NATO, and as a consequence of these years of fighting and just what has happened, you will be demilitarized. Is that what we're saying, or does it look different than what I've just described?
The Ukrainian government will not exist when this war is done. Everything's understandable.
Okay.
The way it's currently
So-
formed will not exist. First of all,
Yeah.
the Russians have already said Zelensky's not he's a de facto head of the regime, but he's not the lawful leader of the government, because constitutionally Zelensky avoided the presidential election. And under the Ukrainian constitution, he no longer has executive, so he's ruling under martial law illegally. And the Russians have said, if you want a peace treaty, the person who signs it can't be Zelensky, because we don't recognize him. There has to be elections, and you have to elect a legitimate president, or the Speaker of the Rada under the Constitution takes on presidential authority until a new president is elected. This is the Russian, statement. But the other thing is denazification. Let's say the Ukrainians had an election today. The hands-on favorite is General Zaluzhny, the former commander of the Ukrainian forces, went on to become the ambassador of Ukraine to Great Britain. Zaluzhny just came out either today or yesterday and said, we need to re-educate all of our children to the standards of the Azov group. Azov is a Stepan Bandera nationalist group. He's saying that Ukraine must become a Nazi nation, a nation built under the ideology of Stepan Bandera. I'm not making this up. He came out and publicly said it today. Russia won't allow that to happen. So Russia will ensure that whatever government rules Ukraine is a government that is not looking for a fight with Russia. That's a government that's willing to live in peace. And that's,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, this happens when you lose a war.
Yeah, why am I struggling? Here's what it is. I mean, obviously we're sitting here. I mean, I don't know where you are physically right now, but I'm sitting here in the United States of America.
In New York.
Okay. Okay. So we're both sitting here in President Trump's America, where many people characterize him as a fascist and a racist and someone who's been sympathetic to many hateful ideologies. But are we in a place, and who has greenlit, as did Biden, horrible atrocities in Gaza and all over the world? Okay. But are we now saying sort of the regime change is good if we agree with it? If you lose a war, the person who beat you gets to make these kind of decisions. I mean, we spend so much time, and rightly so,
Did we do that with Adolf Hitler in Imperial Japan?
Well, let me just point. We've spent so much time criticizing the color revolution, Victoria Nuland of it all, that precipitated all of this. And I guess I would ask you to differentiate between what Russia is attempting or would like to see happen in Ukraine and the influence it hopes to implement over Ukraine in the aftermath of this whenever it's over, and what precipitated the conflict and the West's finagling in Ukraine and its politics. And at what point is it we were entitled to stop you because you were escalating and you were doing the NATO expansion and you were putting all of this military at our border, and it was our right to stop you, maybe even preemptively it was our right to stop you. And at what point are we using sort of metaphors about how difficult it is to turn a big ship to sort of justify what might ultimately be rightly characterized as an overreach in the other direction?
Well, I don't know. I mean, let's take the experience of World War II.
Sure.
Nazi Germany goes out there and does everything wrong, invades everybody, and now they're paying the price. They got the Red Army kicking on the door. You got the Allies landing in Normandy. What happened at some point in time if Hitler went, all right, time out. I'd like to stop the fight right now, and we'll freeze the front. But Germany is a sovereign nation. We have a right to exist. We'll agree to certain things, but we're going to be Germany. And the world should have said, yeah, we respect your sovereignty, Adolf. Good job, buddy. You're going to give up those concentration camps? All right, we got that. You're going to demilitarize a little bit? All right. You think the world would have been right to say, yeah, a world with Adolf Hitler is okay? No. We eradicated him. Why? Because he started a war and he lost the war. I'm here to tell you right now.
He killed himself.
But he killed himself at the very end. And trust me, I don't think Zelensky's outcome is going to be any different, tragically. Because he's a dead man walking. He's got himself in a trap he can't get out of. I don't want that. I'm just saying that this is. But here we are. Ukraine has allowed itself to be taken over by NATO and be used as a proxy. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, acknowledges this. This is a proxy war between the United States and Russia, with Ukraine as the proxy. The Ukrainian defense minister, successive generations of them, has said the same thing. We are a proxy of the West. They tell NATO, use us to fight the Russians. They're bragging to the Poles, we kill Russians, allow us to kill Russians, help us kill Russians on your behalf. And now you're the Russians that are getting killed. How are you supposed to handle that? By saying, yeah, we can have a conflict termination and allow this government to continue to exist with its mindset backed up by the West so that it'll just be reborn again? I think Russia's made the decision that no, this manifestation of Ukraine will never exist again. Something new has to come from it, something that will be conducive to long-term peace and stability with Russia.
So can I ask you, so what's the difference? Why would it then have been willing to allow, in the course of this analogy, and now allow the first year version of the Nazis to say, okay, if you just accept this, the Istanbul compromise, right? At that point, they were willing to accept much less, if I'm understanding what you're saying, than they are now. I mean, the ship analogy suggests that there's a natural inertia that builds over time, and it's legitimate not to change course just because of the inertia of the thing. But I guess I don't quite buy it. I think I need something more substantive, a material change that happened between then and now, not just sort of taking advantage of the time that's passed or growing resentments because legitimately you're upset that you've spent money and lives on this thing.
So let's focus on
I understand that, like emotionally, but I don't know that emotion should be driving these kinds of.
I don't know if you do. I'm not picking on you.
Okay, then help me understand it.
Vladimir Putin meets on a regular basis with the widows of the fallen. And he tells them, we will not betray the sacrifice of your fathers, of your husbands, of your sons, of your brothers. And, there came a point where because of the actions of Ukraine, because of the actions of the West, the sacrifice reached a point where you couldn't accept a half solution. When the level of sacrifice becomes so much that in order to justify the sacrifice, you have to solve the problem. And we're at the point right now, the Russians don't want to talk about casualties. Okay, you said 1.7 million Ukrainian. I buy into that number. It could even be greater. It's going to be greater before this is done. It's going to be over 2.2 million by the time this is finished. But the Russians have lost easily close to 180, 190,000 dead. In all of World War II, the United States lost between 300 and 400,000 dead on both theaters. Okay, the Russians have lost a lot of guys dead, a lot. And Putin owes it to them who died and to the families that this war doesn't end only to begin again. You see, the sacrifice has been made to the point, the sacrifice in blood has been made to the point that if you believe your cause is just, then you must finish the just cause. Ukraine cannot be allowed to exist as a cancerous tumor funded by the West only to seek to metastasize into the Russian body again. You must terminate the tumor, and that's where the Russians are. And people need to understand the sacrifice Russia has made because of a war it didn't want, a war thrust upon it, means that at this juncture there can be no compromise, and there will be no compromise.
In leaving NATO isn't enough to neutralize the threat. I mean,
it's not about leaving NATO.
Cutting off ending permanently the discussions about joining NATO.
But see, look at the game that Europe's been playing, because Ukraine's never been a member of NATO, but they built a NATO army, 800,000 strong NATO-trained, NATO-equipped army operating with NATO doctrine, using NATO intelligence directed by NATO officers. So even though Ukraine wasn't NATO, they were NATO. And the beauty of it was, because they weren't NATO, they could fight the Russians and kill the Russians.
I see the argument that basically, I mean, the West has put Ukraine in a bad position where it has no credibility to even rhetorically offer what Russia would want of it. Because, one, it's betrayed all these promises, I won't move 1 inch to the east, blah, 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 in the past. Moreover, it is willing to say one thing and do another and have this kind of plausible deniability fake NATO state. Like, I completely appreciate why no one would believe what Ukraine has to say, because it is a puppet state by the West. And so the argument I'm hearing is that the only way to cure that at this point is to take over Ukraine, for Russia to be able to determine the political reality of Ukraine for the foreseeable future, maybe not permanently.
The prerogative of the victor? Isn't that what we did with Germany at the end of World War II? And Japan at the end of World War II?
I'm no war historian, and I certainly am no politician. I don't know what has happened in the past. I do know that I am uncomfortable as a sort of humanist whose priorities are sort of self-determination and substantive rights, with what the implications of that framework are, given that most humans in these places are all civilians. And while I completely accept that there are ideological problems that exist culturally, certainly we're seeing that with the polls coming out of Israel, where 80 whatever % of Israelis think that you should destroy every last Gazan or whatever. Sorry, don't quote me directly on that, but you know what the stats are. It's some bad stuff. I'm not trying to minimize the reality of these kind of insidious cultural problems and sort of the reprogramming, for lack of a better word, that needs to happen in places. But I am not willing to sort of knee-jerk say, well, this is what we did, post-World War II, and therefore, because a lot of bad stuff was done during World War II as well.
Sure. I'll say this. Let me answer it this way. I just got back from Russia. And I spent 9 days having the most in-depth conversations with Russians who are heavily involved in this very problem. Many of the people I spoke to were Ukrainians, Ukrainian politicians, Ukrainian academics, Ukrainian soldiers who served Ukraine from the time of their independence in 1991 up until 2014, when, because they spoke Russian, they were compelled to leave. They have a vision of Ukraine that sometimes clashes with the vision of the Russian purists. Because they believe in an independent, viable Ukraine. And I would say the fact that they're allowed to live in Russia and have conversations and be engaged in this debate and play a leading role in the debate, I would say that the Russian position is probably more nuanced than my position. I'm sort of what I'm doing is embracing the absolute definition of the terms set forth by Vladimir Putin. And I'm saying that because that's the Russian reality as articulated. But the real reality is far more nuanced than that, meaning that the Russians at the end of the day are very humanistic. And remember, they don't view the Ukrainians as enemies. They view them as brothers, as cousins, as sisters. In Russia today, there are millions of Ukrainians living there. You can go to Moscow, and I did this. I went to a Ukrainian restaurant where the menu's in Ukrainian language, where the people dressed up in Ukrainian national costume, serving Ukrainian food. It's packed with Russians. And I said, "Why are you guys doing this? You're at war with Ukraine." So we're not at war with Ukraine. We're at war with with an ideology. But we love the Ukrainian people. We love the Ukrainian. We love the Ukrainians are us. How could we hate our brothers? This is a genuine sentiment inside Russia, a genuine feeling of brotherhood. So I would say that the ultimate outcome in Ukraine is, even if it's dictated by Russia, will be one that is far more aligned with your way of thinking, respectful of Ukrainian desires, Ukrainian history, etc., than just people dictating outcomes to people irregardless of their thinking. I think the Russians care for Ukraine a hell of a lot more than the West cares for Ukraine. I know that for a fact, because the Russians aren't encouraging the Ukrainians to continue to throw their men into a meat grinder. The Russians want this war to come to an end, but it has to be an end that means the end of the conflict, not just a temporary pause while the West retrains, regroups, rebuilds a Ukrainian proxy to continue the fight down the road. This war has to end, be over forever. And Russia's willing to work with the Ukrainians to achieve that goal.
I mean, this all feeling like just an extension of Cold War politics. Do you think there is a permanent end to this? Let's say, for whatever reason, because Trump is ideologically committed to ending this and is able to, overcome the war machine and all of the, cabinet members around him who are persuading him otherwise.
It will be an outcome that's not celebrated in the West. I'll give you an example.
Sure.
Belarus. Belarus has been targeted by Europe and by the Baltic states, Poland. They thought it was low-hanging fruit that they could pluck Belarus away from the Russian orbit, and they tried to do so. They tried to have a color revolution in Belarus a couple years ago. If you remember, Lukashenko, the president, coming out of a helicopter, brandishing an automatic weapon, saying, "Bring it on, we're going to fight." Ultimately, what the decision that was made is Lukashenko sat down with Putin, and they entered in what's called the Union State. Belarus today is an independent nation, a sovereign nation, but is linked economically, politically, and militarily with Russia. It is now considered to be an extension of Russia from a standpoint. And that's the end of Europe's designs on Belarus. There will be no more color revolutions. There will be no more interference. I think the goal of the Russians is to create what they call the Three Sisters. The Three Sisters are the three Slavic nations that have always been aligned together. This would be Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And ultimately, they want an independent, sovereign Ukraine, but is linked culturally, linguistically, through religion to Russia. The Three Sisters. That will be peace and harmony, Russia style. The West won't like it because they envision a Ukraine being something far different from that. But I would dare say that at the end of the day, because of the stability that would come about from this, this would be the best outcome for the Ukrainian people, because it would be a permanent end of war with Russia.
Yeah, but the part where you said, but the West won't like it, will they allow it?
They have no choice. They've been beaten. How are they going to stop it?
Well, it wouldn't be the America's first color revolution. Like, why? They're going to stop trying at this
right,
sort
but
of
to have
thing?
a color revolution, you have to have something to grab onto. There won't be anything to grab onto.
Why are you confident about that?
Because the Russians know how to denazify. I think we'll also be looking at a situation where Western Ukraine, which is the home of Banderas, which is a totally different place. The Western Ukrainians aren't, Slavs like the Eastern Ukrainians or the Central Ukrainians. They have a different religion, Greek Catholicism. They're more linked to the former Austro-Hungarian Empire than they are the Russian Empire. And I think what you might see at the end of this conflict is that Western Ukraine is taken over by Poland. Because it historically has been part of Poland. And that solves almost every problem in terms of long-term stability, because if you remove these Nazis, and they don't want to come under the Poles, because the Poles remember the Volyn massacre. The Poles know that these Banderas, who today celebrate Banderism, called the Bandera hero, massacred 130,000 Poles in 1943, the summer of 1943. And so the Poles are like, give them to us, we'll take care of this problem. And then that means that this reduced Ukraine will now be easily absorbed into the Russian order. The West lost its right to vote on this, frankly speaking, by promoting this conflict. And today, what is Europe? They have no ability to project military power into Ukraine whatsoever. Their economies are collapsing. You have the French, you have Ursula von der Leyen saying we have to act now because soon France will be ruled by Putinists. She's talking about Marie Le Pen's party. But now we have the Germans, where Merz is on the verge of political collapse. Wiesel, the head of the Alternative for Deutschland, says if she becomes the president or the chancellor, she will withdraw from the European Union. And that's the end of the European Union, total collapse. So Europe will have no opportunity. It'll be too busy collapsing, solving its own problems to be involved in Ukraine. The United States doesn't want to have anything to do with Ukraine. So, yeah, I think the best hope for peace and stability for Ukraine is becoming part of the Three Sisters, becoming part of returning to its roots, its Slavic roots, its Orthodox roots. That's where they belong. They don't belong in the West. They don't belong doing this anti-Russian, Russophobic nonsense. It's cost them 1.7 million dead. These people shouldn't have died.
Yeah, I mean, the gravity of that number and the gravity of the tragedy is awesome and horrifying and really in conflict with what feels like the way the Western media conveys sympathy for Ukraine, which is to say, let's do more of it, right? The mainstream stance is I support Ukraine and America by giving them more weapons so that they can have more deaths without any sort of realistic conversation being had whatsoever about what it would take to bring the war to a conclusion. I was reading some of the mainstream, I think New York Times coverage of the Trump-Putin meeting. And there was a heavy emphasis on sanctions as a realistic tool to coerce or influence Putin into de-escalation. And it felt deeply out of touch. And as we wrap, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to weigh in on that, the discourse around whether sanctions have any de-escalatory consequence here, or if it's simply pushing Putin, China, India, BRICS countries into closer allyship and kind of amplifying the de-dollarization trend.
Yeah, the way we approached sanctions was counterproductive because we came in with a complete divorce with Russia. And I will say that according to Putin himself, the Russians were very nervous. In the summer of 2022, they had no idea what the Russian economy. They were looking at a 20% reduction in their GDP. Turns out that they had only a 3% reduction, and then they had turned that around into growth.
Why was that? Why was the anticipated harm? Why did not?
Well, the Russians are pretty good at doing what they do. And the Russians had predicted a lot of this. They've been prepared for a lot of this. But they thought that it would resonate even deeper. But the point is, it didn't. The Russian economy was far more resilient than even the Russians thought. And the other thing that happened is that China stood by Russia. China said, no, we will provide alternative markets for your energy. We will ensure continued supply. And then the reality of Europe, even though Europe talked about, divorcing itself from Russian energy, to this day, 27% of Europe's oil comes from Russia. I mean, they can't get rid of it. They have no choice. And then there's a significant part that they don't talk about. For instance, all the oil that goes to India gets refined and puts on tankers. And now all the gas that goes to China gets put on tankers and sold to Europe at 3 to 5 times the rate they would have paid had they just stuck with Russia to begin with. This is why the European economy is collapsing. But this is the reality. The United States also mirroring its aggressive policies in Ukraine with Taiwan, causing China to reflect on the fact that if they allow the West to defeat Russia and Ukraine, there before the grace of God goes them. So they said, we will now fight the Taiwan battle in Ukraine. We will ensure that the West doesn't defeat Russia. India making sound economic choices. The bottom line is that the sanctions didn't work. I've been to Russia. I'm telling you right now, their economy is doing very well. The stores, and this isn't just Moscow and St. Petersburg. I've been to the Far East, Novosibirsk, Irkutsk, Ekaterinburg, Volgograd, you name it, I've been there. Every store is full of food. The prices are very affordable. Normal life. no energy crisis, no water crisis. Um, and this is a country that we wanted to collapse, that we thought we would collapse economically. It's not working. The Russians have now totally pivoted away from the West. Anybody who thinks that you can sanction the Russians don't understand the reality of what's happened. Russia is immune to Western economic intervention because we acted so harshly. They don't use the dollar anymore. They don't care about the dollar. They don't care about Western financial institutions because they've totally pivoted and now what we've done is we made BRICS, which was this sort of awkward economic forum. We've made it a reality now. It's now got teeth because they're united. I mean, how do you bring India and Brazil on board? India was always a fence sitter. They wanted to stay in the West. They didn't want to walk away from the West. They were hoping to turn that G20 membership into a G8 membership, with them being the eight. They wanted to be in the big table with the West. They never wanted to walk away. Today, they're all on board. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS. Why? Because of the stupidity of Western policy, sanctioning them for their energy purchases in Russia. Brazil. Lula wanted to be part of BRICS, but there's a huge Brazilian political opposition to this. Today, Brazil's all on board. Why? Because of Trump's policies towards Brazil. Trump has made BRICS, a really powerful economic institution that will challenge the unipolar vision of the United States of American global hegemony with the reality of global multipolarity. So, sanctions will never work. And Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, he's just typical of these Russophobic people who continue to embrace Cold War ideas, and they're ignorant of the present day reality. Russia is immune to sanctions. We will never touch the Russians with sanctions. We only weaken ourselves. The more Europe sanctions Russia, the weaker Europe gets because the higher their cost of energy goes. I mean, Vladimir Putin, he said it's an insult to call the Europeans idiots because that's an insult to idiots based upon what the Europeans are doing today. It's just lunacy. And every time they sanction, the Russians are just going, what are they doing? It's not hurting us. It's destroying their economy. And today, Germany's economy is in total collapse. Total collapse.
Yeah. It's such a richer picture that you paint, Scott, than what I've been able to absorb from the mainstream media, and even sort of, obviously tapping into the amazing kind of independent media sources. I've loved talking to Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal on this show about this issue, but it's been a while, and I have found myself feeling sort of out of step, and like I've lost the narrative thread of what actually is going on here. And in talking to you today, I feel a lot more grounded in understanding what the moving pieces actually are. And I, in particular, appreciate your insights into, or the kind of dialogue that we had about how we should perceive the messaging coming out of the Trump administration right now, and what we can sort of expect to develop over the next weeks and months and years, given the sort of hard lines or the expectations that Putin has, given what has already transpired, not just in the last 3 years, but in the lead up to 2022 as well. So I really appreciate you spending the time with us here today. This has been really rich and really informative.
Well, I think I just would ask that trying to predict the future with Donald Trump is an impossible task. And I've talked about my beliefs, my hopes, my desires, but this is Donald Trump we're talking about. And anybody who claims that they know what Donald Trump's going to be doing a month from now or 6 months from now, I would take with the greatest. I certainly don't. I hope that we're on the right direction. But I'm not sitting here saying that that's the direction, that's what's going to happen, because Donald Trump is a very unpredictable figure. And that's part of the frustration, because I want peace. I want a better world. And Donald Trump is as much the problem as he is the solution.
I mean, let me maybe vocalize something that I've been thinking about. I have a clearer feeling and understanding of Gaza, Israel, than I do of Ukraine. And when I think about candidates or politicians that are right on that issue, who might share my feelings ideologically about a Palestinian state, when it comes to sort of the electoral realm and who I think could actually implement what I believe, I will admit to some pessimism. My feeling is that you don't get to be president. You don't even really get to be in the House, as evidenced by all of those folks that were just voted out of the last cycle, if you believe in Palestinian rights. You just like, I'm not even getting to a conversation about a Palestinian state or one state or two state, or you don't even get to be in Congress if you're not like a drooling Zionist at this point. So like I have some pessimism consequently about these things being resolved. And the conversation about Trump and what he does and does not believe, it's like the war machine wants what the war machine gets, and nobody puts Honey Badger in a corner. And so it almost feels to me like I am asking less to predict about the future of what Trump is going to do than asking the question, like, how do these things typically peter themselves out? Or, when is the war machine going to get tired of this one? Like it got tired of Afghanistan and just move on to the next thing. Not because anyone's a champion or a hero or it's woke up one day and said, I care about people's rights and self-determination, but because there was just a new shiny object, a new geopolitical priority, and it's on to the next. And I don't want to be, I know in these episodes with Keep the Faith, it's, I don't want to be doomerist about it all, but
Well, you're not wrong. You're not wrong.
I'm not wrong.
I think let's look at it through the lens you've offered here.
Sure.
If Trump is able to bring an end to the conflict with Russia over Ukraine and bring about stability with Russia, it's because the war machine got tired of the Russia narrative. But they need something to replace it. You mentioned this early on, and that is China. And so, I think you'll see a pivot there. Then the question comes, what do we do about China? That's a whole different discussion. But my personal belief is that the war machine has exhausted itself. We've come to a point now where we can't afford this machine. It's too expensive. It doesn't produce results. And I think by bringing an end to the Russian conflict, we will begin to lower the ability of the war machine to influence foreign policy. Absolute. That's me being very optimistic, but I don't believe our country can afford to do what we're doing right now anymore. It's too expensive.
You think we're going to pivot away? I mean, because what's the argument about the military-industrial complex and it being a kind of that's America's socialism? You can join the army. The pork barrel funding goes to districts where they're building the bombs. This is the war economy that we've been on since the World Wars. This is how the country runs. Do you think that is going to be replaced by something else? Is there an argument that with the emergence of AI or something else that we're really going to have a different mechanism?
I'm going to be very
at
honest
work
with you because I know you want an answer from me. I don't know.
Sure.
See, I'm just a simple guy at the end of the day. I was a Marine. I served my country. I really want to spend the last couple decades of what's left of my life living peacefully, playing with my dogs, playing some golf. But I instead have focused almost the totality of my effort on improving U.S.-Russian relations. And I've been singularly focused on this deal with some diversion because of my background in the Middle East and my experience in Israel, with some diversion into what's going on in Gaza. I think we're on the same page in Gaza. I'm picking up from what you said. In Iran, I've been to Iran. I know Iran. So, the Middle East takes about 20% of my time, but Russia takes about 80% of my time, where I am totally ill-prepared to discuss anything other than superficial, headlines, is the Pacific and China. China is a very complicated nation, a very complicated people, very complicated history. I'm sympathetic to the Chinese in terms of the juxtaposition with American hegemony, but to sit here and say I've thought through what a pivot to China will be and what that outcome would be, I haven't. What I'm trying to do is put out this fire here in Russia. And at some point in time, I realize there's going to be a new fire that needs to be fought. Maybe other people have to fight that fire, but I can't focus on fighting that fire right now because we have a raging fire with Russia that's got to be put out, and I have the tool set to deal with that fire. I wish I was smarter. I wish I had more information. Or I wish I could lie to you and tell you that I'm really smart about China and make stuff up, but I'm just not. I just don't know enough.
Well, I don't wish any of those things. I think that you've been really a terrific guest, and I appreciate your willingness to to spend so much time with us here today. And please do tell the audience where they can find more of you and your work on your Substack or social media handles or anywhere else on the internet and beyond.
Well, the easiest thing is to go to scottritter.com. That takes you straight to my Substack page. And then on top of there are the different bars. They'll take you to my YouTube. I have a YouTube channel. I have a Telegram channel. But you can access everything. Get into the portal, scottritter.com.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Scott Ritter. Thanks to all of you for tuning into Bad Faith Podcast today. As you know, if you want more Bad Faith, you can subscribe to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and get an additional episode every Monday in addition to these free Thursday episodes. And don't forget, you can watch, if you're listening, all of these episodes over at Bad Faith YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell there so you get notifications about new episodes as they come out. And also subscribe over on YouTube because usually about half of even the premium episodes are put up for free over on Bad Faith YouTube as well. Very little is paywalled around here. So thanks again for listening. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.